Napoleon is generally regarded as one of history's top military tacticians, but 200 years ago he committed a grave error by leading his army, believed to be the largest European armed force ever assembled to that point, across the Niemen River into Russia during winter. Although it never lost a pitched battle there, his army was almost completely wiped out within 6 months by freezing temperatures, food shortages, disease, and Russian assaults. This proved to be the beginning of the end for Napoleon, who was forced into exile in April 1814. When he invaded Russia with French and Allied troops, he had one of the largest armies Europe had ever seen. The Grande Armée numbered 690,000 men, with other armies making the total forces upwards of 800,000 under Napoleon. At the end of the invasion, his forces numbered less than 70,000. His men had been whittled down by bloody battles, being deserted, captured, or left along the supply line, guerrilla warfare, but mostly nature. His troops had little food because the Russians burnt the land as they retreated, and they were not equipped to deal with the freezing temperatures, which got as low as minus 30 degrees Celsius. On particularly bad nights, thousands of men and horses succumbed to exposure. It's said that soldiers were splitting open dead animals and crawling inside for warmth, or stacking dead bodies in windows for insulation. And then Hitler did the same thing and lost too. Another top tactician of his time, Hannibal, made a critical mistake during his dangerous trek across the snow-capped mountains. At one point, Hannibal's army, which consisted of several war elephants, came to a sudden halt when they refused to walk across a certain path. Angry at the holdup, Hannibal, who had been marching at the back, came to the front and slammed his cane into the snow-covered path to show everyone it was solid and thus safe enough to cross. However, that one hit with the cane triggered a huge avalanche that ended up killing more than half of his 50,000 men and several of his elephants. Ultimately, it took 4 days for the survivors to escape the frozen carnage and descend below the Alps. Legend has it that the Trojan War had been going on for a decade when the Greeks, unable to penetrate the walls of the city of Troy, decided to switch tactics a little bit. The Greeks planned to trick the Trojans into letting them behind those closed walls. They would leave a gift for the Trojans with the Trojan horse and pretend to retreat home. On orders from Odysseus, they built the horse, which was said to be big enough to fit a few dozen soldiers inside. After they wheeled it to the city gates, the Greeks faked their departure, and the Trojans, convinced they'd just won the war, rolled the gift inside their walls. That night, the hidden soldiers opened the gates to additional troops, and Troy subsequently fell. The moral of the story? Don't trust Trojan horses, or at least check what's inside next time. The original recordings of the first humans landing on the moon 40 years ago were erased and reused, NASA admitted several years ago. The US government Space Division admitted in 2006 that no one could find the original video recordings of the July 20th, 1969 landing. An exhaustive 3-year search for some tapes that contained the original footage of the Apollo 11 moonwalk had concluded that they were probably destroyed during a period when NASA was erasing old magnetic tapes and reusing them to record satellite data. Either way, the lost tapes means the world will probably never again see the original images beamed back to Earth by the lunar camera that is now resting on the moon's dusty sea of tranquility, right where Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin left it. Thanks, Obama. The Alaska Purchase was the United States acquisition of Alaska from the Russian Empire in 1867. Russia wanted to sell its Alaskan territory, fearing that it might be seized if war broke out with Britain. Russia's primary activities in the territory had been fur trade and missionary work among the native Alaskans. With the purchase of Alaska, the United States added 586,412 square miles of new territory, and it became its 49th state. Russia, however, sold Alaska to America for 2 cents an acre. All in all, they received $7.2 million for the region, which is around $121 million adjusted for inflation in today's currency. During 2007 alone, Alaska's gross state product was $44.9 billion. The attack on Pearl Harbor was a surprise military strike conducted by the Imperial Japanese Navy against the United States naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, on the morning of December 7, 1941. However, not a single U.S. aircraft carrier was in port. Either way, the attack led to the United States' entry into World War II. The following day, December 8, the U.S. declared war on Japan. Subsequent operations by the U.S. prompted Germany and Italy to declare war on America on December 11, which was reciprocated by the U.S. the same day. More than a century ago, the RMS Titanic set sail on her maiden voyage across the North Atlantic. But just 5 days into the trip from England to New York City, the luxury liner collided with an iceberg off the coast of Newfoundland. Consumed by damage, she sank, killing more than 1,500 passengers and crew. This occurred despite not having enough lifeboats because the ship was apparently unsinkable. Multiple mistakes were made that collectively sent the Titanic sinking. First, there were no safety regulations in place for a ship as large as the Titanic. It didn't carry adequate safety equipment. For example, there were only 16 lifeboats, enough for only about 1/3 to 1/2 of the passengers on board, and crew members weren't prepared with binoculars or proper lighting. The Titanic itself was untested. Its equipment, yes, but it was never given a test drive, and was ultimately unproven. The crew was also not fully up to speed on the liner, its equipment such as state-of-the-art wireless messaging system, and its emergency procedures. NASA lost a Mars orbiter because during 1999, a team of engineers used the English system of measurement, while the rest of the team used the metric system. The use of two different measurement systems prevented the spacecraft's navigation coordinates from being transferred from a spacecraft team in Denver to a lab in California. The orbiter was then lost in space, costing NASA around $125 million. Faulty construction led to the meltdown of the Chernobyl reactor, the consequences of which are still being counted to this day. In 1986, 4 reactors went out of control during a test, culminating in an explosion and fire, with the latter destroying the reactor building in its entirety. The explosion consequently released an unsafe amount of radiation into the air. The explosion caused the immediate death of 2 plant employees, and then in the months following, 28 firefighters and cleanup workers died because of exposure to the radiation. The Chernobyl disaster was the worst nuclear power plant accident in history in terms of cost and casualties, and is one of only 2 classified as a Level 7 event, which is the maximum classification on the International Nuclear Event Scale, the other being the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear disaster in 2011. The battle to contain the contamination and avert a greater catastrophe ultimately involved over 500,000 workers. Long-term effects such as cancers are still being investigated. The money lost in 1986 due to the mistake led to $358 billion in cleanup, and the value of lost farmland, which, adjusted for inflation, is $720 billion. Following the evacuation several days after the Chernobyl disaster, Pripyat, which was once occupied by more than 50,000 people, eventually became completely abandoned. The city is commonly known as the Zone of Alienation, with landmarks including theme parks, hospitals, shops, and playgrounds, being a reminder of how society was forced to leave their lives from the city. Its radiation resulted in it becoming uninhabited for over 20 years. Some random idiot left the door open to Constantinople, allowing the Turks to conquer with ease. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 had an astronomical rippling effect on the Western world. It effectively ended the Middle Ages, marked the start of the Ottoman Empire's domination, and ushered in the Renaissance. While the Ottomans possessed the numerical advantage and the cannons, thick and high walls surrounding Constantinople prevented them from rapidly overwhelming the capital. If the Byzantines had held out long enough, help from their European allies could have turned the tide of battle in their favor. The Byzantines' efforts were wasted, however, due to one single error. That's right, someone forgot to close a gate. Following the Ottomans taking over the gate and raising their flag above its tower, pandemonium followed. Convinced that their city was doomed, resistance faded shortly after and ended with the Ottomans finally taking Constantinople. Ironically, this very gate was the same one the Byzantines used to retake their city from the Crusaders 200 years previously.